Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today is March the 30th, 2021, and I'm here today with Professor Alphine Jefferson, Professor of History. And it is a real honor for me to interview today with Professor Jefferson, who is an oral historian and the person who really has guided me the most in my oral history project. So this is a real honor. So Professor Jefferson, tell us about your background, where you grew up, and your early educational experiences.
I was born actually in Frog Level, Virginia, which is a part of what's called Dawn in Caroline County, Virginia. Basically, it's the corner of 301 and Route 30. If you're ever driving to Bowling Green, you will pass right now the Frog Level Volunteer Fire Department, and I was born about 5 miles from there. So I was born in rural Virginia when I was 6. My birthday's December 31st, so I didn't start kindergarten. So I'm working on an essay about the year I spent with the women because I could not go to school. I was with my mother and her friends who did the things that rural women did. Canning and picking apples and putting up greens and dealing with the pigs and making quilts. So I did all of that as a little boy. When I was 6, my parents moved to Baltimore. So because I had not gone to school, I was put in kindergarten. And the teacher had my mother come in, and she told my mother that I was retarded. They used the R word back then because I did not color appropriately. So they were concerned that I had learning disabilities. So I didn't know anything about it. I was just a child, and I heard the word, and my mother said, "Oh, this sort of worry about you because you don't color well." I said, "Well, I color the way I color." It was not until I was a student taking some special high school courses at Johns Hopkins University in 1967. I had a biology class, and the teacher in that biology class said, "Look on the back page of the lab book and tell me what numbers you see." And everyone in the class looked on the back of the book, and they saw 8 and 13. I saw nothing. That's when I realized I was colorblind. So being colorblind suggested to the teacher that I had mental deficiencies because I did not color appropriately. So I started kindergarten one semester that February. I did first grade and half of second grade, and then my parents moved back to Baltimore. So we first went to Baltimore in February of 1957. We moved back to Virginia in fall of summer of 1959, and I went to Dawn Elementary School for 2 years and a half. And Dawn Elementary School was a brand new school built in 1957, sort of as a way to keep blacks and whites from going to school together. So it was a 7-room school with grades 1 through 7. And I had a very good experience there. It was a brand new school. It had flush toilets and running water. And growing up in rural America, I did not have that. My parents built a new house in 1955. It was 4 equal-size rooms, 12 by 13 feet each. And it never occurred to them to put in a running water or a toilet. That was not added until 10 years later, interestingly enough, because back where we lived in the country, no one had running water. No one had an inside toilet. So I grew up with a well and an outhouse. In February of 1962, my parents moved back to Baltimore, so I went into 5th grade there. And I was in 5th grade and 6th grade in elementary school. Then I went to Lombard Junior High School, which was 7, 8, and 9. I finished there in 1966, and then started Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore in 1966, and I graduated from Frederick Douglass in 1969. It was a wonderful experience being in those schools because given segregation, the quality of the teachers in both junior high and high school was absolutely amazing. I had teachers who literally drove from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore every day to teach at Frederick Douglass. I had teachers who had PhDs and doctoral degrees, just some amazing, amazing people. I was a student leader in high school. I was the late room monitor. I was president of the United Nations Club. I was treasurer of the French Club. I was a member of the Toussaint Louverture Literary Society. That's a mouthful to say. And I was on the principal's commission for something. The principal would not interview me to be considered for the president of student government because I had a beard at 14 years old. They put me out of high school and told me that you cannot come back until you shave. So I went to my Pentecostal church at 1053 Monument Avenue in Baltimore and testified that I was being persecuted by the devil because they had put me out of high school because I had facial hair. So later that night, Mother Brown came to me and said, "Don't worry, boy, I will give you my third husband's razor." So she gave me her third husband's razor, which was just an awful, awful experience. I did end up being vice president of student government. But because I was a student leader, the principal nominated me and someone else to go into a special program at Johns Hopkins University in the summers of 1967 and 1968. I didn't know what it was, but I said yes to the opportunity. It turns out it was the pilot project of Project Upward Bound, which has been around for a long, long time. So I was one of 42 Black, white, and Latino males. It was all male, predominantly Black, but a few Latinos, a few whites, obviously working class families. The program was designed to help those students get ready to go to college. So what was wonderful about that experience was the second summer, summer 68, the directors brought in 42 admissions counselors, and I talked to all of them. And out of those 42 admissions counselors, I decided to apply to Harvard, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Delaware, Swarthmore, Bucknell, and Gettysburg. And I had no idea what I was doing because prior to that, I had only heard about Black colleges. My older sister went to Morgan State. My older brother went to engineering school in Baltimore. And neither of my parents were educated people. My father couldn't read or write. My mother only went to 7th grade. And even in Baltimore, I wasn't around college-educated people. Most of my life in Baltimore was the church. I was very, very involved in church. I was at church 5 services every Sunday and 3 or 4 services per week. So I didn't know a whole lot about colleges, but talking to the woman from the University of Chicago, I was just so excited about the way in which she talked about that educational experience. So Chicago became my first choice. Interestingly enough, I applied to those schools, and my parents, being uneducated people, said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm applying to all these schools." And they said, "You're not going to those places," because they had no idea how do you go to those kinds of places. Interestingly enough, the first letter that came was the letter from the University of Chicago. And I remember opening it and just sobbing, just absolutely sobbing. Also, interestingly, I had a conversation. The dean of admissions from Harvard called and said, "Hey, dear Miss Jefferson," because my first name is Alphine, half my mail comes to me Miss, the other half comes Mrs. I said, "It's Mr. She said, Mr. Jefferson, we are sorry that we did not take you to Harvard, but we have arranged for you to go to our feeder school. All you have to do is say yes. You have a full year scholarship to go to Washington University in St. Louis."
That's their feeder school. I didn't know that.
I said, "Thank you so much," but I got into my first choice. And he said incredulously, "Your first choice?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going to the University of Chicago." He said, "What?" He raised his voice. He said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm going to the University of Chicago." He said, I said, "Mr. Jefferson." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want me to look at your application again?" I said, "No, Chicago was my first choice all along." So I was blessed to go to the University of Chicago. Had I known the University of Chicago was the University of Chicago, I would have been intimidated.
Yeah.
But because I had no idea that college, was not college,
Right.
I simply loved being there. And I was blessed to be. Coming from my background, I had a set of habits and behaviors that allowed me to sit down and read a book, and then read another book, and read another book, and another book. So I can say categorically, I read probably 97, 98% of all the books assigned to me at Chicago. And at the University of Chicago, the average reading was a book a week per class. Mm-hmm. I tell students that I took one course, Subjection and Domination, 25 books in 10 weeks. I read every book, went to every class, wrote every paper, talked as much as anybody, and still got a C. I said that to a class here, and a student said, "That's not possible. You couldn't have read 25 books in 10 weeks? And I said, "Yes, I did." "Oh," I said, "let me tell you, young lady, between 5th and 6th grade, I read 116 books. I wrote a 3-sentence summary of each book and gave it a grade. And I still have the little blue booklet where I did that. So yes, it is possible to read 25 books in 10 weeks, obviously, because I certainly did that. And because I was so excited to be there, it just felt like the place for me that was my intellectual home. And certainly as a middle child, I never thought that I was the smartest child in my parents' family. Never. My oldest sister was a math educator, my brother an engineer, my younger sister went to Tuskegee and was invited into the vet program, even though she didn't go. And my younger brother had 162 IQ. So I never thought I was the smartest person. And certainly being in Chicago, I was nowhere near the smartest person. But thank God I had a set of habits and behaviors that allowed me to go to the library and spend 6, 7, 8 hours every day of the week, except Saturday. Saturday I'd do laundry and clean my little room and start writing the draft of a paper. But for me, it was the intellectual home that I didn't even realize at the time. And I was surrounded by just wonderful people. So I did all of the work, and I was able to graduate in 4 years without taking summer school. I racked up some Ds. Actually, I worked far harder for my 7 Ds than I did my 7 As. I was lucky and blessed to be able to take John Hope Franklin's graduate courses in Southern history.
Oh.
So I took the Old South and the New South with the world's foremost authority on Black American history. I had a 3-week seminar reading Capitalism and Freedom with Milton Friedman. I had more than 18 interactions with Milton Friedman. I lived in a dormitory, and in the dorm, Chicago had professors living in the dorm. So I lived the first year with Robert and Carol Stein, and they didn't do much. The second year was Fred and Alice Brooks. He was director of admissions and financial aid, and he was living in the dorm. His wife was pregnant with their first child. Actually, about 12 years ago, I surprised them by showing up to their 50th wedding anniversary, and they visited me here in Virginia. They were a part of my socialization and my growing up. I became chairman of the Sherry Hour. Chicago had Sherry Hours. So famous people would come over, sit on the floor, and talk to undergraduates in the resident director's home.
Yeah.
So I hosted Milton Friedman multiple times, John Hope Franklin, Bruno Bettelheim, Erica Fromm, George Stiegler, George Schultz, Ed Levy, Julian Levy, and multiple civil rights leaders who were in and out of Chicago, and that was just natural. And it was wonderful for me because I had been involved in church a great deal, and I had been master of ceremony for many, many programs, and I had taught Sunday school, so it was very comfortable to function as the social chair. And I just knew those people and interacted with those people and did that constantly. Chicago had tickets to downtown events. The admissions office would offer. So I went to the Chicago Symphony regularly because I had gone to the Baltimore Symphony. Frederick Douglass High School also had tickets to the Lyric Opera in Baltimore, and I was in walking distance. So I once saw Richard Chamberlain in Man of La Mancha at Lyric Opera in Baltimore. So but I got my first record player. I went out and bought that record. I was able to see through Chicago Andres Segovia, the famous Indian zither the player 3 times. So I was always at high-level cultural events in downtown Chicago because they were giving tickets away, and I would always reserve one. So I was just blessed to take advantage of all of the opportunities. So I went to Sherry Hours, I went to extra lectures. I didn't take a course with Hans Morgenthau, who was a very famous political science professor and advisor to government, but I attended his lectures. A famous guy was there in religion. What was his name? Emile, I'll have to think of it. Very, very famous person. But all of those people gave lectures, and I attended the lectures. Yeah. And I just did that very, very naturally all the time because I was interested, and I would pick up the book and go look at this person. So I got into the education. I knew I wanted to be a history major. I knew I wanted to teach. I wanted to teach since 5th grade in Baltimore because I had a male teacher in 5th grade. And in the back of my mind, I now know why I affected him and that experience. He was the first man I saw at work who was clean. Because growing up on a farm, all of the men were farmers or loggers, or they worked at the sawmill, or they were dirty at work. And this guy was standing there with chalk in his hand, writing on a bulletin board in a suit and tie. Yeah. And I didn't think it consciously, but I think in the back of my mind it made me realize that there were jobs you could do.
Right.
where you didn't have to be dirty.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in history, so I was one of the few people who didn't change his major. I knew that from the beginning. Chicago had a policy of allowing undergraduates to take graduate courses, so I took John Hope Franklin's 2 graduate courses. I took graduate courses in the American Revolution, and I took courses with couple of famous socialists. Maynard Kruger had run for vice president on the socialist ticket in 1948. He was my social science 3-quarter semester teacher. He supervised that course. I even took an economics course with Donald McCloskey, now Deidre. He was on his way to winning the Nobel Prize in economics, but he trans to female, and he lost.
That must have been unusual for that time.
Well, he was a male when I had
Yeah,
him. Later, he
Yeah,
became
right.
Deidre, and she's still one of the most prominent economists in the world.
Yeah.
However, because she's female, she's no longer on that "you will get a Nobel Prize" track. Had a course with Valerie Jarrett's father, James E. Bowman, medical doctor. This is a black male who went to Howard and did his medical degree at Howard. And because he couldn't find a good job in America, he and his wife moved to Iran. And he was a medical doctor to the Shah's family. And because both Dr. Bowman and his wife looked white, I'm sure they did well. I mean, they were black people who looked white, so they fit right into Iran. And that's where Valerie Jarrett was born. She's not an American, she became an American citizen, but she was born in Persia, interestingly enough. His course was called Man, Environment, and Disease, and he was the first person to talk about environmental racism. And I learned from him about that corridor. It's called Cancer Alley in the Mississippi Valley, where large numbers of poor blacks and poor whites get very high incidence of cancer. The final exam in that course was a research project. Because I had stuttered severely for the first 15 years of my life, I decided to write on stuttering. So the research revealed that in 97% of all cases of someone who stutters, there is no physiological basis for the stutter. It's psychological. And that was pretty shocking to me, But I had stuttered severely for most of my life. I stopped stuttering December of 10th grade, so that would be the fall of 1966. And I'm not sure which of the 2 realities helped me to stop stuttering. One was for 6 weeks, I had 15 minutes a week of speech therapy with a white woman who is Mrs. Black with the Baltimore City Public School System, and she taught me how to say, "Sammy Snake sat by the seashore searching for seashells." So I said that over and over and over and over and over again for 6 weeks. Concurrent with that, it was a Sunday night service, and Bishop Page said, "Come on down front, Brother Jefferson. We're going to pray for you, and you're going to stop talking funny." And he laid hands on me with the blessed oil. And when I went back to high school that January, because this was the December break period, I no longer stuttered. And it's interesting. It was interesting because I never stuttered in French, and I never stuttered when singing.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
I've heard that singing is a therapy.
Yeah, interestingly enough. So, I don't know how I got on that subject.
But what a heady time at University of Chicago. That was really one of my questions was how did someone from Frog Level end up at University of Chicago?
It was a special program at Johns Hopkins,
Yes,
and the fact that I was nominated out of 642 people, 40 people graduated with me. I was one of the people. So it had to be the hand of the Lord.
Yeah.
It had to be the hand of the Lord. What was interesting about the experience is that since I didn't know any better, and people there worked, people worked very, very hard. There were some first-year students. One guy, he was taking graduate level math courses his first year of college. I mean, just some genius in math.
Yeah.
So all of these people were around. And it was the kind of place where if someone mentioned a book and you hadn't read, I mean, I don't know about most people. I know I did. If someone mentioned a book I hadn't read, I would read before I met that person again. That's why I ended up reading the book Sun Chief, Autobiography of a Hopi Indian, H-O-P-I. That was in another humanities series. I was in a different one. But I read that book because someone mentioned it. And I read, and I read, and I read. And thank God I did, because I'm able probably to talk to most people about most subjects just because I was a very serious college student. I say this now both with amusement and embarrassment. My first Sunday in Chicago, I jumped up, got dressed, put on my Goodwill suit, ran downstairs, took a cab, and told the cab driver to take me to a holiness church. I'd never been to Chicago before, had no relatives in Chicago, knew no one there, but I jump in a cab and go to church. This man could have driven me to Indiana and sold my kidney, literally.
Yeah.
No one would have known.
Yeah.
No one
Yeah.
would have ever known. But I went to that church, and I talked to the people at the end of the service, and they told me that there was a church closer to me.
Yeah.
So the following week, I walked to a church that was about almost a mile from my dorm room, and it was an okay church. At least it was accessible. And I didn't know who was the minister at that time, but I missed the Sunday meal because we only had the breakfast and the dinner meal at 2, and I got back late, and the women in the cafeteria said, "Boy, you missed dinner." I said, "Yeah, I was at church." They said, "We'll keep dinner for you, so don't worry, just come back from church." So over time, as I attended that church, I realized that the pastor of that church was Arthur M. Brazier. If you look up his name, you'll see that he's a major person in the civil rights movement.
Oh.
Arthur M. Brazier, B-R-A-C-I-E-R. So I attended his church while I was in college. I didn't join the church, I just went
Yeah.
most of the time. I look back at that now, I just laugh. You're in America's second largest city at the time, and you jump in a cab and you go to a Pentecostal church, which was just bizarre.
At least the cab driver knew where to take you.
Well, yeah, he found one. But I loved my experience at Chicago. I did French. Chicago you had to have a whole year of at least 5 different subject areas. So it was a year of humanities, a year of social science, 2 years of a language or 2 years of math. I had a year of physical science and a year of biological sciences. So I racked up 4 Ds in French, a D in genetics, a D in 2 Ds in physical science. But I was in those courses, and because I did all of the work and went to every class, in 4 years of college, I tell students this here, and they don't believe me. In 4 years of college, I missed 2 classes total in 4 years.
Oh, I believe that.
Total. One was because I had to come to Baltimore for a wedding of which I did not approve, and the second, I was in the hospital on my back with the compressed vertebrae that they wanted to operate on, but I told them the Lord would heal me, so I never had that operation. But I went to every class every day, always, and was always ready and prepared. I was just blessed. I decided that I wanted to have a study abroad experience, and I went probably what was considered the world's best undergraduate education at that time. The advising was just absolutely awful.
Yeah.
So I had to create my own study abroad program. Luckily, Chicago decided to move resident masters into the dormitories. So it actually built onto my dorm an exquisite suite for a senior professor. That happened to be Kenneth Northcott, his wife Victoria, and his 3 children. And he became resident master of my dorm. And he was from England. He was chair of the German department. And I would go to all of the events he sponsored. And there was one Sunday afternoon event. I remember I was sitting on the floor, and I remember exactly what I had on: a bright yellow shirt, a pair of black pants, a pair of black shoes, and socks that I had walked from Chicago into the black community on 63rd Street, where they told us not to go the Saturday before that day, and bought a pair of black silk socks. Well, turns out my black silk socks were actually dark green because I'm colorblind.
Oh.
So I had on these green socks, black pants, and black shoes. But Kenneth Northcott, this famous German professor from England, just sort of kept looking and glazing at me, chuckling as I argued with this obnoxious, unruly British fellow. And he and I just went back and forth, I had no idea that that man was an eminent British historian, Hugh Trevor Roper.
Oh, my goodness.
Hugh Trevor Roper.
Oh, my goodness.
You know the name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I argued with that man. I talk about him in my African history classes. Based on whatever I was or was not saying, Professor Northcott said, "Alphine, you will do an independent study with me in modern German literature." And I said to him, "Professor, nein sprechen Deutsch. I do not speak German." He said, "I want you to do this." So the chair of the German department gave me, from Frog Level, an independent study in modern German literature. I had no idea, it was at 8 o'clock when we met. He would give me a glass of what I thought was orange juice. It was actually a screwdriver. I had no idea. And the tomato juice was really a Bloody Mary. And for some reason, I read The Tin Drum, Caucasian Chalk Circle, and several other books in modern German literature. And for some reason, he decided to invite the specialist from the German department to come to our interaction. So I'm sitting there with these world authorities, arguing with these people. I know nothing, right? These are German professors. But there was some reason that we just had this wonderful interaction. So I was just blessed. So I got to Europe because I told him I wanted to go. And I said, I'd really love to fulfill a childhood dream of going to Paris. So he said, well, I said, I don't know anybody in Paris. He said, well, my ex-girlfriend, Caroline, lives in Paris. I will give you her name, write her, mention my name, and let's see what she can do. So I wrote Caroline in my really bad French. She wrote back and said, any friend of Kenneth Northcott's a friend of mine. I have arranged for you to stay with my friends in Paris. So I told my parents I'm going to Europe. They thought I was...
Was that the summertime?
No.
Semester?
It was fall of 1971. It was the beginning of
semester,
my junior year.
Uh-huh.
So I went for fall semester. I got from Baltimore to New York City to the airport, and I flew Air Lufthansa, I think, yeah. So I went from New York to Belgium with a stopover in Reykjavik, which is sort of neat. We weren't there very long, but at least I got out and walked in the cold. And we landed in Belgium. And I got out of the plane, and I was going to find the train, and I noticed I needed to buy some food, and the money seemed off. The prices of stuff were I was just floored with the amount. And come to find out that the Belgian franc is not the same as the French franc.
Right.
And I didn't know it. So the 337 was really like 333. It was not 337.
Yeah.
So I ate something, found my way to the train station. I was in the train from Belgium to Guédenau-en-Paris, and 20 miles outside of Paris, I was talking to this Dutch priest, Catholic priest, and I said, oh my God, I'm going to Paris and I don't speak French. And he said to me, Alphine, I said, yes. He said, you've been speaking French to me for the last 3 hours. Your French is fine. And it hadn't occurred to me that I'd been speaking French to this guy for 3 hours. It didn't even realize it. So your French was fine, yeah. Yes, my French was fine. I get to the Gare du Nord, I call the people with whom I'm staying, and they said, no, we have a car, but we're going to come and pick you up. So I had to find my way to 205 Rue de Tobiac, en Paris, arrondissement 3. So I found my way there, and I had a trunk. I don't know why I had a trunk in addition to 3 suitcases, but I had a trunk.
That's what people did.
Yeah. I had a trunk.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand the French system that floor number 1 is not floor number 1 because there's no first floor. So I was on etage number 7. So I had to carry the trunk up. So I ended up living with Denis Melieu, and his name was, they were members of the French underground.
Oh.
They were anarchists. If they were still in my life, they would be on the FBI's register for basically terrorists. Yeah. So in my bad French and their bad English, we had these emotional conversations. And they told me I was too passive and I needed to be angry and I needed to be militant and I needed to bring down, give it to the man. And we just went back and forth and back and forth. I didn't even know what they were talking about because it's high-level sort of political anarchy, essentially. But they were members of the French underground. I stayed with them for 2 weeks, and they were decent enough. They basically just left me alone. So my first day in Paris, I walked for 14 hours straight, just kept walking up and down. I'd stop and get a cup of coffee, get some little cheese and bread, and keep walking. So I found my way to the American Cultural Center in Paris, and I met a few people there. And the woman always serving tea had to bark at me because I would say something incorrectly in français. She was an American. And I met this guy named Lou. He happened to be an American, he happened to be Jewish, and he happened to have a car. And he happened to be really crazy. So we did all sorts of things all over Paris. He would show up at about 2 o'clock with a bottle of wine and a tin of pâté.
All you need for the afternoon.
Right. I also met two other Americans. One, a boy, he was really a boy, from Concord, New Hampshire. And he was there to paint. And the other guy was white, both were white guys, from Cincinnati. And the guy from Concord, New Hampshire said, I'm going to go home. I miss my square dancing. And the guy from Cincinnati, they were both in Paris, independent of each other, but they met as Americans. They were both to paint. And he said, I need to go to Cincinnati. Football season is starting. And, you know, those sports had never been important to me, so I just thought they were crazy. But I hung out with Lou, and I saw the world premiere of Dennis Hopper's movie. What was it, 1971? It was an American movie, and he was there, and I actually met him. Dennis Hopper?
Was it Midnight Cowboy?
Yes. Yeah. In Paris.
Oh, my goodness.
And I went to Tour d'Alphine and all of the other places. So I had a wonderful 2 weeks there. What struck me about Paris was, and I noticed it instantly, that the porters were very erect, properly attired, and they did not, as a Black American understanding service, they did not give off the same vibrations of being a servant. They were very proud to have their jobs, to have their pressed uniforms. I also learned that in Paris, most working class men would come to work dressed, change their clothing, work in their work clothing, take off their work clothing, take a shower, and then put on their turtlenecks, their jackets, and their slacks and go back home. So it was a very different relationship to work. Work is what you do there, and when you're in public, you do something else. So that started in my mind something that I've been working on for years, and that is to write about work. Because the Bible says, I mentioned that the servant is worthy of his hire, but in America we have the notion of menial work. And this essay or book I've been working on for 40 years, the basic concept is there is no menial work. There's simply work which needs to be done. This was then confirmed by my relationship with the white British woman who cleaned my room. I lived in a place basically called International House, and it was full of international students, mainly white Americans. And I became best friends with the 6-person delegation from the University of South Carolina. Lucy McCall from McCall, South Carolina. I would go to her room every night and kick out whatever British bloke she had brought to her room, and she was not going to seal whatever deal he had in his mind. So I was braiding my hair at the time, and I would go up and say, get out, and he would look at me like I'm crazy, and I would have to put him out. But some interesting people there. But the point I was making is that the woman who cleaned my room, she could talk high Shakespeare. She had gone to Stratford-on-Avon 22 times. So you could discuss Midsummer Night's Dream with her. You could discuss Hamlet. And I was just shocked that a woman who was a cleaner could do Shakespeare. And it then confirmed my initial impression of the Frenchman, that your job does not define who you are. And that has stuck with me all of my life.
Well, as an oral historian, I'm sure you're reading or are familiar with the Studs Terkel working, or maybe it's called work or working, but it's just about, I think it's the oral history interviews of people about their jobs, and the opening is work is a 4-letter word.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
I know Studs Terkel. The Oral History Association gave him an honor when we were meeting in Milwaukee, probably about 1997. Actually. Yeah, he's another one of these people that's absolutely amazing.
Well, he was from Chicago, wasn't he? So that might have been that.
I attended, actually, he was also in a movie called Reds. And he was on the panel that spoke at that, and I was at the world premiere of that movie in Chicago. I have been to Chicago every year since 1969, exclude 2020. First time in 50 years. So I've been 50 years, since 69 to 2019. I didn't go in 2020, but as soon as can go.
And this virus is behind us.
Because I write on Chicago. My research is on Chicago.
Well, what a wonderful, I mean, that is so formative. I mean, just everything about that.
It was an amazing experience. I even had a little British girlfriend. Sort of
in Chicago?
No,
in Paris?
In England.
In England. Okay. No.
I did. I was in Paris for 2 weeks.
Tell me about England. Okay.
Then I left Paris and took the trains to London. And then I had to find my way to Warwick University
Oh, okay.
in Warwickshire, which is in Coventry, which is in
Yeah.
Warwickshire. So I got there and moved into my dorm, and I had a single room with the bath and a shower, which was really, some American had given a lot of money to create this several hundred person dorm for international students. So
Nice.
I met all these students. There were 6 groups of American students, some from Portland, Oregon, the South Carolina group, some from a couple other schools. Actually, a woman from Swarthmore borrowed my typewriter. Yes, I carried a typewriter, a manual typewriter. She borrowed my typewriter, and when she finished her paper, she taped on my door a thank you note with a Kit Kat. And it was the first time I'd ever had a Kit Kat. And that because one of my favorite of all candies. In England, I took 3 courses: Modern Latin American History, the Industrial Revolution, and British History. Had a wonderful time. I got a B+ in Latin American History, a D in British History. The guy wrote on my evaluation that I had a penchant for grasping the wrong end of the stick. Yes. And a B- in the other course. It was 3 classes in the British system. But that system is quite different. You do not have to go to class. I went to every class. You just take exams
You just
at the end.
pass the exam at the
Right.
end. Yeah.
But what was interesting, the woman with whom I was involved, she was upper middle class, Alexandria Chiles. Her grandmother was the first white person born in Rhodesia.
Oh.
Literally. This was 1971.
Uh-huh.
So grandma was probably born about 1878, 1890. And she was, so Alexandria called her grandmother or told her she was bringing her American friend Alphine home. So Granny had arranged for Alphine, the white female, to sleep in the same bed as Alexandria. I'm sure I was the first colored person to walk through the front door of that home built in 1727. As a historian, I was just shocked to see a house with that.
Yeah. Like marker.
Granny took one, looked at me, and turned and walked away. And she must have instructed the servant girl to put me on the other side of the other side of the other side of the house. Because I was so far from Alexandria that over the course of the evening, when I finally went to my room, the woman who worked there, and she was a young girl, she felt so sorry for me. She came in with 2 hot water bottles, and just to get, it was freezing cold.
Yeah.
And there's no central heat, as
Right.
you know about England. But her grandmother would not receive me properly, ever. Would not sit down and have a meal with me. And I guess, being a young female, she was just doing this to irritate her grandmother. But it was interesting. I did go meet the local witch in that area, who was a friend of the family, and I had this wonderful conversation about the supernatural, which is something I've always had in my consciousness as a result of growing up in rural America in a family that talked about that sort of stuff. But what was interesting was 2 other people affixed themselves to us, Alexandria and me, Kier and Kitty. And Alexandria told them not to talk when we were hitchhiking, to let me talk as the American, because I would be unique, or let her talk because she had the upper class accent. So I became aware of how the accent gives you entry or becomes an exit. And because Alexandria had the upper class proper act, people were always very kind to us. They would pick us up, they would buy us food, they would offer us places to stay, which was really, 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 really interesting. But I had a wonderful time there, and it's there that I sort of developed my interest in Africa and the African diaspora, because there were some Africans there from Ghana and Kenya.
In England when you were there.
Right, in 1971. And people of color, because that's the first time I heard that term, because all of the Indians and Pakistanis, that's how they referred to themselves, as people of color.
Even then. I
Oh
didn't
yeah,
realize-
1971, oh yeah. And I was introduced to a concept that I didn't know anything about called Paki bashing.
Pakistani?
Yeah, British boys would rough up
The Pakistani.
Pakistanis, and many bus drivers were Pakistanis or were Indians. They couldn't tell the difference, so they just went out and beat up colored people. And
Yeah.
that was something that they did. And that made me aware of the saliency of a quotation I use all the time. Robert E. Park said, quote, "Prejudice is a function of visibility." Prejudice is a function of visibility. If you look different, then I can find a reason to treat you differently. Yeah. So that was interesting. But because African students were there, I started talking to them, and one guy made me an African meal. And he said, "African food is hot. Do you like hot?" And I said, "Sure, I like hot." Well, he made me some chicken. That was so hot, you could tar the road with it, and it would, oh my Lord. That stuff was amazing. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I came back home, I remember, because everybody said, "Why don't you stay? You have extra time." And I said, "I've never been away from home for Christmas. Not that we did anything special. But I'm grateful to say I have never not been at home for Christmas. I was there for both parents until I was in my 60, and then one parent is 61, one parent is 63. So I've always been at home. So I flew back on the 22nd, and I got home on the 23rd of December, which was wonderful. And I thought, I ran out of money. I called my parents and asked them to send me $50, and they didn't. They said, "You got yourself there. What's the family rule? The family rule is love many, trust few, learn to paddle your own canoe." They said, "You paddled your canoe there, and you will be paddling your canoe back."
Yeah, love many. I should write that down.
Love many, trust few, learn to paddle your own canoe. So I called a very good friend from college, Judy, now the Honorable Judy Mitchell Davis, and she sent me $50. Her father owned Edna's Restaurant. Edna's Restaurant is a famous restaurant on the west side of Chicago where Martin Luther King established his headquarters when he went to Chicago. So my best friend in college was the sister of Edna, who owned Edna's Restaurant. And she sent me $50, so I got back home. I didn't understand
Were you
money.
active in any civil rights movements or anything during college?
Not really, because I was in college in 69 through 73. And not a whole lot was going on. I'm sure there must have been, but I was not conscious of civil rights. I was literally in the library. Everybody.
Yeah, you were had your head down.
I
doing your
was
work.
I was afraid of failing out and having to return to the farm. And return,
So
and
you had to put all your energy into that.
I put all of my energy, and it was a lot of work. I mean, it was constant work, but I never turned in a paper late. I never missed a class. I did my work. I absolutely did my work. At college, I was involved in a couple of, I edited a black student newspaper for a while. I was editor of the Black Light. I was involved in campus activity. I was on a special blue ribbon committee that Ed Levy created to look at some student complaints. Students complain. I also became aware of, because I got to know Ed Levy very well, Lorna Strauss, who was the dean of the college, Hannah Holborn Gray, who became the first female president of the University of Chicago, a historian. We were always in these people's houses. I mean, it was just natural to be in professors' houses all of the time. So I had my first raw mushroom in Chicago. I didn't drink or do drugs or anything in college because I've never been a drinker in that way. But I did sip sherry at the sherry hour because I was the host of the sherry hour. But obviously, you're just sipping some sherry. There was a Blue Ribbon Commission, and I was involved, but not in politics. I was, I remember standing out in the freezing cold for 3 hours, raising money for March of Dimes. So those sorts of social activities.
Sort of charity work.
Yeah.
Well, then you ended up at Duke immediately after Chicago?
Yes. What happened was everybody said, "Well, you're getting a bachelor's in history, you have to sell insurance." But I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And now that I think about it, in 5th grade, I wanted to teach 5th grade. In 6th grade, I wanted to teach 6th grade. In 7th grade, I had Mr. Grant. He taught history, and I wanted to be Mr. Grant. In 8th grade, I had Mr. Warren, and he taught geography. So basically, as I went up, I decided I wanted to teach at that level. And since every other person at Chicago was either going to law school, med school, or getting a PhD, I had several jobs at Chicago. One job was to operate the PBX, the switchboard. Hello, Pierce Tower. So I knew everybody's business. But I also worked in the cafeteria, and it was interesting working in the cafeteria because I'd have to always drive these boys out because my dorm for the first 2 years was all male. and there would be literally hundreds of napkins with equations. And it was normal at the University of Chicago for people to say, I'm going to win the Nobel Prize, not you.
Yeah.
And they would be doing equations. I mean,
Right.
that was just normal.
Yeah.
Or for fun, and I didn't even know, and I still do not know what it means. 3 or 4 guys would walk along the road, and they would factor license plates.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, yes, take the
I
numbers. and do something.
I was like, okay, I can't help you with that 0. Okay, this is my only contribution. So it was that kind of place, just amazing
Yeah.
place. I don't know when I thought. Well, I knew I obviously wanted to go on.
Yeah.
So I applied to Harvard for grad school, Brown, Yale, Pittsburgh, and I just happened to go home for spring break, and there was a letter from Duke saying, we're interested in you applying to graduate school here. And my parents, of course, didn't even tell me during my weekly 90-second telephone
Right, right.
conversations that I had this. And the professors at Duke, Larry Goodwin and Bill Chafe, said, we're coming to the history convention in Chicago. Would you come and meet us at the convention? We want to talk to you. So I talked to them, and they were creating the first PhD oral history program in the country at Duke.
Yeah.
So they recruited me out of Chicago, Al Broussard out of Stanford, Marcia Darling, who's the first black female student government president at Vassar, Cynthia Griggs Fleming out of Tennessee, and Dawn Daniel came from New York. So there were 5 students in the history department started in the oral history program. I was not accepted at Harvard or Brown. Yale wrote me and said, Dear Miss Jefferson, we have lost your application. Please reapply next year.
Nope.
Well, if you've lost my application, how do you know who I am?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, right.
Exactly. But I got into Pittsburgh and Delaware and Duke and Johns Hopkins because my undergraduate degree's in colonial history. So I was going to go to Hopkins and study with Jack Green, very famous historian.
Yes.
Yeah, he had accepted me as his graduate student, but that was in Baltimore. And I thought that if I had to spend this much time in college getting a degree, graduate school is going to be worse, and there's going to be tension with trying to go to church, teach Sunday school, be reabsorbed into family. So Duke seemed more attractive in that, one, it was offering more money. Oral history was a new field about which I knew very little. And it was in Baltimore, even though I really wanted the Hopkins degree. I just realized that I would be reabsorbed into family activities and birthday parties. So I went down to North Carolina, lived off campus for the first year, did not have a car, had to take 3 buses to get to grad school. One time walking to school, and this is a moment that seared into my head. I was walking to school with the paper I'd stayed up all night and written and typed, manual typewriter, and some guys in a truck with the guns in the back of the truck called me names and racial epithets and threw golf balls at me as I was walking to school. And I just sort of chuckled because I said, here I am doing what Booker T. Washington say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah. And yet these people are harassing me.
They haven't gotten the memo.
Right, they did not get the memo. So I decided I wasn't going to return to Duke until I could get a car. So I went home for Christmas. I gave my father $300 and said, find me a car. And then I flew off to Chicago to see my girlfriend at the time. And when I got back, he had purchased a car from a brother in our church, $295. But it was also January of 1974, the first oil embargo. So I'm driving an old, big, huge Malibu Chevy from Baltimore that I did not know.
Guzzler, yeah.
And I had never driven that route with my own car. I'd been in my parents' car. Yeah. And I've never driven my parents' car until I was in my 40s, so they just wouldn't let you do that. So I was terrified I'd run out of gas, so I kept going to get gas, but there was no gas. So I was wasting gas. So it was the first time I missed the class in grad school because I just could not get there. But I had a car for that second semester. Then during that summer, my professor realized that I had been a resident advisor at Chicago. I was a dorm advisor to Fred and Alice Brooks. He was the director of admissions and financial aid of the undergraduate school. So I applied to be a dorm director at Duke. And of course I was rejected. So Larry Goodwin out of Texas, he protested and I became a dorm director I supervised 15 men, but they were in a fraternity. We were in a space that was a fraternity, but the fraternity didn't have enough people. So I had no authority over the frat part.
Just the dorm part.
Yeah, just the dorm. And I was successful that year, so the second year they gave me 104 men, freshmen.
Oh, great.
And I had 3 assistants. And that went pretty well. And then the third year, I was in Southgate, and that was 75 women, 75 men, and that was the hippie dorm. And it was the hippie dorm. It just all sorts of crazy stuff that I had never even imagined could go on, went on there. But I kept that. And then after that, I said, okay, this is slowing me up. So I moved into an apartment in Durham, wrote most of my dissertation, went on the job market in 1978, and ended up taking a job at Northern Illinois University. And I was at NIU from 78, technically until 84, but for 83, I wrote 2 fellowships, a Mellon Fellowship at Harvard and an NEH Fellowship for a year off. And I got them both at the same time.
So you had to choose.
And I had to choose. I could have, and a few people suggested I give them both different dates, but coming out my background, there's no way that I'm going to cheat. I'm going to lie. I'm going to be deceptive. So I turned down the chance to teach at Harvard because that Mellon Fellowship came with an obligation to teach 1 course in the fall, 1 course in the spring, and the rest is your research time. Because the NEH was a full year off with no obligation. So I stayed in Chicago. In some ways, I could be Skip Gates because it was exactly when he was talking to Harvard, because I know Skip. But had I gone to Harvard, I wouldn't be here.
That's right. Well, I do want to talk about, wind your path around to you. So you were at Northern University,
Northern Illinois
University. Then for how long? Then you.
So I got the NEH grant
Yeah.
for that year, and then my buddy Al Broussard, who'd come out of Stanford, he had finished Duke. He was teaching at SMU. He was director of Black Studies. He used my NEH grant to get his NEH grant. So he said, "Why don't you come and fill in for me as director of Black Studies at SMU?" So he got his grant. So I went to SMU in the fall of '84 for 1 year. He decided to take a job at Texas A&M, so I competed again in a national search, and I was awarded a tenure track position in Dallas, and I was there from '84 to '89. And I hadn't finished my book by then, and it was just time to leave. So I went on the job market, and I got a job at the College of Worcester.
In 1989.
I started at Worcester in 1989 as
So you were there a good long time.
16 years.
Yeah.
But in that 16-year period, actually, I spent a year at Johns Hopkins, being the program chair of the Oral History Association on several times. When I was chair of the convention in New Orleans, the keynote speaker was Michel Ralph Triot, a Haitian scholar who wrote the first history of Haiti in Creole.
Oh.
And his book was read around campfires to people who had never heard their history. So the way that Richard Candida Smith put the program together, he had Triot give the main address, but he asked me to do a commentary on the man's talk, which is rare. I don't know why he did, but he did. And I did the commentary on his talk. And I remember 2 interesting parts of it. Afterward, about 34 elderly white people walked up to me and said, "Thank you for giving your talk. Oh, what a wonderful talk," because we couldn't understand a word he was saying. He had an accent, but it was so sophisticated.
Yeah.
Whereas my commentary on it,
They could understand.
it was basically thesis, evidence, conclusion.
Yeah.
But based on my talk, he said, "Wow, why don't you come to Hopkins and you and I work on an article or maybe even a book about orality and silences?"
Oh.
So he invited me to Johns Hopkins in the fall of 1999, and I accepted because I took a year off from teaching at Worcester because I had added African history to my portfolio there. I had taught it before, but not at Worcester because the guy retired. So I get to Johns Hopkins back in Baltimore, so it's my 3rd time living in Baltimore.
And that's your old stomping ground.
Right,
yeah.
right. So my family was very happy. I get there and he's gone. He was at the University of Chicago. And he said, so I called him and said, what are you doing? He said, well, come here. I said, no, I've done Chicago. I'm there every year.
Yeah.
So I stayed at Hopkins, and I had gone there to study African history, but all of the African history people were on leave or on sabbatical. So I ended up teaching a graduate course called Traditional Healing and African Medical Systems. Something I've been interested in, sort of the supernatural, but using herbs and plants. So I had several graduate students in this reading course, and I served on 2 PhD committees in African history at Hopkins. So I was a member of the graduate faculty there. So my family, and I moved into a building I didn't even realize it was. I lived at 1001 North Charles Street. My older brother had lived there with his girlfriend 30 years before. Interestingly enough, the exact same building. It was close to this exclusive gym, so I exercised with the mayor of Baltimore. What was his name at the time? So yes, I was at Hopkins, and I taught that course. Then I came back to Worcester in 2000. I bought a condo in 2000. And then I decided to, what happened was, interesting enough, the Lord works in mysterious ways. One of the men at Randolph-Macon had applied to be provost, but he was an internal candidate. And I was on the provost.
Had applied to be provost at Worcester.
At Worcester, yes.
Okay, somebody from Randolph-Macon, administrator.
No. Someone at Worcester applied to be provost at Worcester.
Oh.
And he listed, who was the dean when we came? Haynes, help.
Oh, Holyer.
Holyer. Holyer was his reference.
Oh, okay. Oh, so somebody Worcester internally hoping to move up, and he put Robert Holyer as his reference.
So I happened to pull this man's portfolio.
Sure.
Again,
Yeah.
act of God.
Yeah.
I call Holyer. I talk about Tom. We have a wonderful talk
like a
about
reference, right?
as
yeah.
a reference.
Uh-huh.
And I just happened to throw out, oh yes, I'm going to be in the area in 2 weeks. And he said, what? I said, I'm from there. I've been in Ashland all the time. He said, would you come by and see me? So that started a series of conversations. And that's how I got here, because I happened to just pull. There was no job.
Right. So do tell me how that went. So he said, come by and see me. This is 2000, or this is 2005 now.
This would have been summer of 2004.
And he said, come talk to me, because there was not a job, but he was interested in you.
Yes. So he asked me, could I do colonial history? I told him, because Scanlon was sick.
Yes, Scanlon was getting ready to retire.
Right.
Yes.
And I said, it's my undergraduate.
It's American colonial.
Right. So we started a conversation. In that conversation, I just talked to him. Then I came back in the spring of 2005, and I met Alva Hughes and Tom.
Tom
Porter.
Right.
Yeah,
He was chair of the department at the time. Yeah.
And I don't know how to say this, but they were not excited about my candidacy, because some people just didn't like Holyer, and they thought Holyer was
micromanaging kind of.
Well, putting somebody on the department. So actually, I can send you the email. I got an email from Beth Gill welcoming me as the newest member of the sociology department. Yeah. But once history knew I was coming and I had given up the demand for tenure, I mean, I was a tenured full professor at Worcester, a much better school, quite frankly. And I'm certainly not bitter about any of this, it's just a statement of fact. I was an untenured full professor at Randolph-Macon for 8 years.
You were untenured, but full
professor for 8 years.
You came with the rank of full professor.
Right.
But they required that you go through the tenure process.
Right. Yeah, all over again.
Right.
So I saw young white boys come in after me and get tenure before me. But my objective was to be here with my parents, and I knew I was being fine.
So that was your aim. A part of it was you wanted to move back closer to home. Your parents were getting older.
That was primary. What
Right.
had happened is, just like I was home for every Christmas, I visited my parents regularly, and I was here for Christmas of 2001. It was a Saturday. I said goodbye to the family, December 30th, and I drove back to Ohio. I was sitting in front of my fireplace with a friend from New York who did not drink, so I was not having a drink on my birthday, which is December 31st, and I got a call from my older sister saying my younger brother had dropped dead of a heart attack at 42 years old. And I had just driven back to Ohio. So my head was, so I got back on a plane and I flew here, back here, to be with my parents as we handle the business of my younger brother, who lived with them, Hiawatha the genius. He had gone to college in North Carolina. So I just sort of started thinking about maybe
it's time to move back.
maybe. Because I'd been in Worcester for, 2005, 16 years, exclude one, the year at Hopkins. So I started just thinking about maybe I'll look for a job. I looked for a job, had an interview to be director of the honors program at VCU. I didn't get it. That went to someone more qualified. He was the associate director of the honors program at Kentucky. So I was not angry or bitter about that. That was 2003. So when the day I talked to Hollier, I didn't mention the job. I just said I would be in the area. Because I was quite happy at Worcester. I just bought a condo. I'd had a condo for 5 years, and I was tenured for professor, chair of all the committees, promotions and tenures. I was fine. But I came here, and I've been very, very, very happy here. What has been, so when I first came here, I didn't teach Introduction to Black Studies. Rutledge Dennis taught Introduction to Black Studies.
Was he in the history department, or
no.
was he in sociology?
He was in sociology.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember him.
He
you
was.
and I had, just for the record, had the same first year.
Right.
Dennis Rutland or Rutland Dennis?
It was Rutledge Dennis.
Rutledge.
Yes.
Dennis.
He was a black American who had converted to Judaism, and he had a faux British accent because he was from Charleston, South Carolina.
Oh, well, Rutledge is a very Charleston name.
Is it really?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, yes. So he taught Intro to Black Studies here. He was a tenured full professor half-time. But I also think he taught full-time at VCU, and he taught full-time at either Mary Washington or the other big school in Northern Virginia. So I really believe he had 2.5 jobs.
Sounds like, yes.
Yeah, he really had.
Yes.
He really had 2.5 jobs.
Yeah.
So I didn't teach Black Studies my first 5 years here because he was still here. I didn't teach Black Studies until he left. He finally left. I went to his 70th birthday party, and someplace in Richmond, and I walk in, and half the people there are the Jewish people from my building, 5100 Monument Avenue, where I lived. And I was like, what are you doing here? I said, I teach with him. So he left, and then I started teaching Black Studies. But because I was interested and had done it at Worcester, I taught the first-year seminar. Remember the
Yes, the FYEC, the first year experience, and that was Hollier's baby,
right.
I believe. Getting the multidiscipline aspect.
Right. I taught that for 7 years in a row.
Oh my goodness.
It was an excellent course, and I wanted to go on record that course should have become the cornerstone of Randolph-Macon's first year education for first-year students.
Oh, tell me, describe the course. What was the name of it, or what was it?
It was the FYEC. It was the first year.
Right, but I mean, you're talking about not specifically the course you taught.
No.
Just the FYEC, well, which it was for a few years. It was
7 years. I taught
it. was the cornerstone
right.
of first-year experience.
I want to go on record as saying, I regret to say that no one had the intelligence or the wisdom or the foresight to realize the value of that course. It would have made the school distinct, and since that time, advising has been absolutely inferior here. Absolutely inferior. It is not very good. I don't care what they say or what they print. It's inferior because I have students who are always messed up because the advising, particularly by professors, less the professional staff, by professors themselves, just do not know what they're doing. And that was, when I first got here, they laughed about the course being curriculum by grant. And having been in higher education all these years, I know what that does. But someone should have had the intelligence to go up and raise the money and name it the so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so first-year experience at Randolph-Macon College, one of a kind. And nobody in the administration had the intelligence or the wisdom to do that. And that, I think, is a serious, serious flaw.
Well, I think it was Hollier. I think Hollier was one of the...
Right.
Had the vision for it, and then he left.
And people hated him so much, they threw the baby out with the bathwater, which is a cliche I would circle in your paper, on my paper. But it was a stupid reactionary response. Yeah. It was absolutely stupid. Absolutely.
And it was financial as well.
Well, you go find the money.
Yeah,
you go find the money.
They did have the money initially, and then they couldn't sustain it. Yeah. Right.
So I started teaching Intro to Black Studies. And as a part of, I did my first study abroad trip with Reber Dunkel. We went to Brazil in 2000. Well, no, we went to Ghana in 2008. Okay, so what happened was I was here, and I had gone to Ghana with Ohio State University.
When you were at Worcester.
When I was at Worcester, because I had picked up Africa, and I told them I needed some in-continent experience. So the president gave me $5,000 to go. So I went with 2 white female English professors and had a wonderful time in Ghana. So when I got here, there was a course on the books that Leska was going to go, Beth Gill, and Alva Hughes. Those 3 were going.
Oh, that's interesting.
He was in science.
He's a computer science.
Right.
Chuck Leska was computer science.
Right. So it was Leska, Gill, and for some reason they decided not to go, and students had signed up.
Uh-huh.
So since I had just had the experience, I talked to Reber, and Reber had spent time in Ghana.
Oh,
and then that's how he and I basically took over that course. And that's the year we took 28 students.
And that was a J-term course?
Yes.
To Ghana in 2008. Okay, right. Okay, good.
In the summer of 2008, we took students to, right. So he and I took students to Ghana in January of 2008. In the summer of 2008, he and I won grants to go to Brazil to set up a Brazil program. And we took students to Brazil in 2009. And then
You and Reber.
Yes, Reber and I. He had taught in Minas Gerais for 2 years in Portuguese in Brazil, because he'd been in the Peace Corps in India and he'd been to Ghana. So he speaks Portuguese. So we took students 2009. That was a fairly large group, and we had a class going in 2011. So he and I taught on campus for 2 weeks, and then getting on the bus to go to the airport. Continental said it was that ice storm, 2009.
Oh.
So we did not go, even though we had set up the course, we had hotel, everything. We were literally stepping on the bus.
Oh, I did in 2009 or 11?
2011.
11, because so you went in 2009 and you were repeating the course to Brazil, and you couldn't go because of an ice storm.
Right, because of the ice storm. So we didn't go. But in 2010, Reber and I had gone to Ghana. Again.
Back to Ghana, Brazil, Ghana, Brazil.
Right, exactly. So at Randolph Macon, I did Ghana 2008, 2010, 2012. Reber didn't go in 2012. I was the only professor. In summer of 2008, I also went to Guatemala with Deborah Rodman. I taught a course on Afro-Latin America, and she did her research area.
A summer class.
So there, and
you've been to Cuba?
Yes, Brian Turner and I did Cuba 2016 and 18, and then the group I went with to Kenya in 2020.
J-term?
Mm-hmm.
Right before the pandemic hit, you were in Kenya. Now, who went with you to Kenya?
Ted Shekels, Amber Peacock, and Consolata Matua Mambo.
Yes.
Yeah.
So were there 2 courses then? That's 4 faculty were there.
Yeah, 4 different courses.
Yeah, 4 courses.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, I've probably had as much study abroad experience as most people at the college. So I'm very grateful for that part of my Randolph Macon experience.
Yeah.
I just love travel.
That's one of the great things about our curriculum, or just the way our calendar is. The J-term does give people the chance to travel who probably wouldn't if they had to take a whole semester. But, it's a great opportunity for
If
so many
I
people.
had money, I would endow study abroad.
Yeah.
I'm disappointed that the administration hasn't been more aggressive in finding someone to endow it.
Yeah.
Because it fundamentally alters.
And so many of our students have a chance to do it who, just wouldn't have any of those opportunities.
Some wealthy students here. I taught a fellow last year. Every year he's been on a different study abroad program.
Isn't that wonderful?
I mean, it's just amazing. And he said, "Oh, it's just changed my life."
Yeah, and
just
we
totally
have so
changed
many
his life.
fascinating. Now I want to go back to Black Studies for just a minute, because when you came, you didn't teach Black Studies.
No.
You said for the first few years because this other
So-
man was teaching it. But I do want to talk about this development of the Black Studies program, because it is now just in this year been in the last year been developed to be a full major. So I just want to talk about that and your influence on that.
Well, I started teaching the course. I don't know what popular means, but lots of people. I teach it now every spring and every fall, because I I filled up my time with the first year experience, see, those first 7 years. So when I first got here, Mark Malvasi and I sat down because he's in a similar area, and he decided, oh, well, I'm not going to teach these courses anymore. You can have them. So he gave me the history of Black America, History 337. He gave me the antebellum South, which I studied with Franklin, so I certainly felt comfortable doing that. So I started teaching Introduction to Black Studies, and lots of students started. At one point, I taught the Black Studies seminar with 12 students who were the minors, who were minors.
Yes, yes.
So it became a pretty popular minor for a number of people. Last year, we graduated our first Black Studies major. Last year, I'm talking to a young female now who wants to be a Black Studies major, and she was in my Africa course, but her advisor told her she couldn't take it.
Because why?
He told her incorrectly.
Oh.
It was History 100, J-term Africa. She was already in the course. He said, oh, you need a prerequisite for that. There is no prerequisite.
Not
so
for 100.
advising is bad here. It is bad. It is not good. It is not good. And this was a professor who should know better. He's been here 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
He should know better. So I started doing, and what's interesting, and as I tell the students here, at Worcester and at many places in the world, at Worcester, half of the Black Studies majors were white.
At Worcester.
Yeah.
And that's not the case here?
No. We have some. I would say it can be about 25%.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had half. But at Worcester, it was regularly half.
Yeah.
And I tell students here that those students who majored in Black Studies who were white at Worcester, one guy, Eric Hackinson, I'm hopefully saying his name incorrectly so no one can look him up. He was from the Upper East Coast prep schools. He majored in Black Studies, played lacrosse. His prep
That's
school,
an interesting combination.
his prep school found out that he was a Black Studies major at Worcester. They called him up and said, how would you like to come back to your school as our multicultural specialist and assistant lacrosse coach? So blonde, white guy, Black Studies, but he's got the credential, multicultural specialist at an East Coast prep school. And his girlfriend, who played lacrosse, said, we're coming, because she wanted to go back home and they would get a house on campus. And she was going to pursue her master's degree. So several Worcester white students had those kinds of experiences. I remember I was sitting in my office one day and this white guy with a British accent comes in and says, you're the black guy? You teach the black thing? Oh, the black thing. Oh, I need to talk to somebody about the black thing. I said, sit down, calm down. What is wrong with you? He said, my father's going to marry a black woman and I don't know what to do. You got books? Can you help me? I said, who are you? He said, my father's marrying a black woman. I'm going to have a black mother. I need to learn. I said, sit down. Talk to him. I said, what is your name? He said, Duncan Jones. I said, okay. The name didn't ring a bell. Calmed him down. We talked. And I said, well, who is your father? He said, David Bowie. He's married Imam. I have a black, yeah, literally. So I gave him some stuff. It was interesting. He graduated 4 years later, and Worcester asked me to be Bowie's bodyguard. So I stood with David Bowie. Imam is running around taking pictures. She's a photographer.
Yeah.
So they're looking at her like, don't we know her? Who is this little black woman running around?
People should be taking pictures of her.
Right. But she was taking pictures, and I'm standing with David Bowie, as only David Bowie could do this. He sees this tall white guy walking by, and he says, hey, man, do you have a fag? Oh. And the guy I said, hold on, he means cigarette. That's a British term for cigarette. It's a cigarette. I'm screaming like, not to offend this guy. So the guy gives him a cigarette, lights it, and says, oh, you're David Bowie, nice to meet you, and walks on. So you can't use that word around him. But he was just being David Bowie. But he went on to actually become Oscar-nominated film director. Another guy, J.C. Chandor, was a Black Studies major, white guy who majored in Black Studies and is a major. J.C. Chandor, C-H-A-N-D-O-R. He's a film director. So a lot of the black students who were in Black Studies, some went on for Black Studies, some went to law school, some went to medical school.
Well, it's just a great multidisciplinary major, yeah.
Yeah, but I tell students now that the largest job category I see anywhere right now is Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's everywhere.
And everyone's scrambling to hire good people.
Actually, I was called about, 18 months ago or 2 years ago? A trustee at Worcester said, how would you like to be the vice president? And I said, I am not attending any more 8 o'clock meetings. No, this is not going to happen. He said, what do you want? I said, I don't want anything. I am happy. I'm going to retire. So I just think it's important, and since we're the only college in the VFIC with the Black Studies major, that's a selling point.
And it's a great time, that's really great timing for that,
And it is that kind of course which allows students to explore areas many of them have never considered. And given that 40% of all students at liberal arts colleges are varsity athletes, and given the number of blacks who participate in sports, there is a stage for that, given the interactions of blacks and whites who play sports together, be it football, baseball, basketball, tennis, or whatever. And a lot of those students have been in my classes. So my average class is, sometimes I regret it's always so many men, but I can have 18 men in a class, and that's pretty typical. But I can say categorically that the athletes at Randolph-Macon have consistently been in the best group of students I've taught here, consistently.
Yeah, the athletes, I believe, just as a student body, have a higher GPA than non-athletes. I think that discipline and the coaches keep them on track, and
So that's been a pleasure. That's
good.
Yeah, and the group who went with Reba and me to Ghana in 2008 was 8 football players. Easton Davis, who was on every picture of the college, and that whole group of men. And then Andrea Jackson, who was the Iraq veteran. She was older than the other students. Actually, she and I and Easton had a conference call recently. We were trying to set up a scholarship for study abroad in the name of Jakai Colson.
You had mentioned that. If you want to mention that for the record, go ahead.
Well, Jakai Colson was a student here. He was a minor in Black Studies. I think he majored in sociology, I believe. He graduated from Randolph-Macon and became a police officer in Montgomery County, Maryland. And I think 4 or 5 years into his job, he was on his way to meet with the captain to have a confidential conversation. And he was killed outside of the police station. Yeah, Jakai Colson. Actually, his parents were down about 18 months ago, because he was inducted into the Football Hall of Fame posthumously. And his mother has made a quilt about him, a family quilt.
I would love to see a scholarship in his memory. That would be really
it was transformative for him and for other people.
That would be
absolutely transformative.
Well, I hope that will get off the ground. Well, Alphine, I want to just make sure we touch a couple more highlights here. You are very active in the Ashland-Hanover community, besides all the things you do at Randolph-Macon. You are president of the Hanover County Black Heritage Society. You're on the board of the Ashland Museum, the Ashland Theater, Hanover Tavern Foundation, and probably many others that I'm neglecting to mention. Recently, or for several years, you led the efforts for community Juneteenth ceremonies, and you were the featured speaker at the Martin Luther King Day celebration this past year, 2021. Did you want to comment on your community involvement and how it supports your teaching at Randolph-Macon?
It's interesting. When I first came to Randolph-Macon, I lived in Richmond after I stayed with my folks for 2 months. I lived on Monument Avenue for 10 years. And I would go visit my parents several times a week. I'd take them food or go spend the weekend, actually, with them. And my father would always look at me and laugh and say, "Boy, you sure you're teaching at Randolph-Macon?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, your cousins don't think so. They think you're like all the other blacks over there. You're either pushing a broom or you're making pancakes." And he would just laugh and laugh and laugh. So a lot of family members, because they just couldn't imagine that someone from their family would be teaching at a place so prestigious. So I had my first Juneteenth program, actually. It was called Juneteenth on the 13th. And I know exactly when it was because I buried my father the day before. That was we buried him on August 12, 2013. My Juneteenth program was June 13, on the 13th. Several people from the college could not come because that was the day that Lauren Bell and Jim got married. On that very day. I mean, who would know? So I've had a Juneteenth program virtually every year since 2013. What's been important about the Juneteenth program, that I've been surprised at how many Black Americans who live 2 blocks from Ashland prior to the Juneteenth program had never been on this campus for anything. And I've had several people tell me that repeatedly. We are so happy that the campus has opened up to us. So lots of people have come to Juneteenth programs and some of the other programs that we have had at Randolph-Macon. So in the community, the reputation of the college is much more positive, because people have come on campus, had interactions with people. So I've been grateful that I have been a part of opening up the campus to external groups. That has been very important. The Hanover County Black Heritage Society, of which I'm president, we have offices in a small museum in the Henry Clay Inn. Small little place over there, but that organization is trying to preserve the history of Ashland. And the founder of that organization, Carolyn Tibbs Hemphill, I wrote the introduction to this book she wrote on her grandmother, Betsy Hogg Tinsley, who actually, this black woman gave 2 acres of land to create the Confederate cemetery in Ashland. Black female gives the land to create Confederate cemetery in Ashland, which is interesting. So one of the ongoing conversations has been between Carolyn Hemphill and Mariah is that Carolyn's mother's a Tinsley and Mariah's a Tinsley, so they're trying to figure out if there are any connections. The other part of my experience here, of which I'm very, very proud, and Mariah was, and Peter were very important parts of this, we were able to put the Janie Porter Barrett Home for Wayward Colored Girls was the first name, that's not the official name, on the state and historical registers. We were able to put a marker, a state marker at Abner Baptist Church because John Clark founded 6 churches in this greater area. So there has been a great deal of indirect and direct Randolph-Macon outreach into the community in very positive ways. In very positive ways.
And for the record, I'll say that's Mariah Rippey.
Yes.
Mariah Rippey, right. And Peter, right. Well, we're interviewing in March of 2021, and we have just finished the first year anniversary of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, a year. And we've had lockdowns and political polarization and civil unrest. All of these unsettling events have exposed racial injustices, activism, and backlash nationally and locally. Randolph-Macon's not been immune to these events over the last year. In October 2020, President Lindgren announced the creation of a Racial Equity and Opportunity Commission to, and I'm going to quote, identify and help implement improvements to the college to create a more equitable, inclusive, and welcoming environment where all faculty, staff, and student members of the RMC community, and specifically those historically underrepresented here, can thrive and fulfill their full potential, end quote. So you, along with alumnus Preston Bryant, are co-chairs of the History Subcommittee, which I'm proud to serve on, along with you. What hopes do you have for the Racial Equity Opportunity Commission and or the History Subcommittee?
I think its most valuable contribution will be to uncover and make public an open and honest history of the college and its relationship to various communities, the small rural community where it started down in Mecklenburg County in the small little town of Boynton, and that its move to Ashland came at the invitation of the city, which is quite positive, and that the institution itself has been a very important part of the local community of this place, both black and white. And even though black students, just as female students, couldn't come here initially, this place provided an opportunity for some people to have very good jobs, given the societies in which they live. For example, I grew up on a farm, and my parents always talked about get your education so you do not punish out in the heat and the cold. So a whole lot of people have very elitist social locations in that they think of a good job as being a lawyer, a doctor, or even a college professor. But a lot of people think a good job is not having to be outside in the weather, or not having to walk, or not getting dirty. And there are many jobs of this wonderful staff at Randolph-Macon that are technically good jobs given these people. So the college has focused, has been a foci of employment for literally hundreds of people that would not have a job at an educational institution if it were not for the college being here. My concern is I wish it would open up and allow some of those people who do work here to advance by taking courses or getting themselves ready to take courses and ending up with a Randolph-Macon degree. Because a lot of the people have a lot of wisdom and a lot of connection and a lot of positive feeling toward this institution. It would be nice to incorporate some of those people into our wonderful staff also. So I hope one of the outcomes of the commission is that we come up with a clearly articulated path for people over time. Because if you're going to be employed for 10 years, you're 30 today, you're going to be 40 tomorrow. Why not be 40 with a degree? And a lot of people would want that if we provided that opportunity. So I think the college needs to be a little more honest and open about creating. Technically, it's on the books and people can do it. The reality is that I haven't met anybody in 16 years who has, just because the people with whom I've spoken say that, okay, yeah, I can sign up, but my supervisor will not let me go. So we need to be honest about that and find a way. And just think of helping to develop our own social capital in the people who we already have on campus. And helping those people become those people who might even come back in professional positions. If we get them that bachelor's degree, they can go off. So I think that would be a positive outcome. Certainly, all of these schools have a relationship to the institution of slavery. And I explained to people that slavery was an economic institution. Certainly, it had its cultural underpinnings, it had its racial underpinnings, and it has its religious underpinnings, but we have to understand it in situ, in the situation of its time. Technically, there were some black Americans who owned slaves. One of the rhetorical questions I ask in my class is, if a black man who was enslaved buys his own freedom, and then the freedom of his wife, quote unquote wife, and children, is he a slave owner? He technically gets a paper
It says
that says that you own yourself. He gets a paper that you own this woman, you own those children. And I'm not obviously apologizing for slavery. It was an institution, it was a horrible institution. It existed in many places in the world, but what happened in America was it was a less fluid system than it was in many other places. And that legacy continues in America, and we have racialized it in such a profound way. Going back to my favorite quotation from Robert E. Park, quote, "Prejudice is a function of visibility." And if you are visibly different, then people might treat you differently. There's a very tragic story about a white police officer in Pittsburgh 3 years ago. He did his ancestry DNA. He's a white police officer, been a white police officer, a white man all of his life with a white wife and a white family. He came back 18% black ancestry. He shared that with his fellow police officers, and they started putting bananas and hanging nooses on his locker. He was harassed so much until that white man, quote unquote white man, had to leave his job as a police officer in Pittsburgh. The people with whom he had played buddies and cards and football and all those sports, just because he said, okay, I have black blood. So that means that race is very salient in America. And somebody that we have perceived this way for all these years, all of a sudden is not, just because he said, I have ancestry. So we as a nation need to come to terms with the fact that we have not had the conversation. That was one of John Hope Franklin's permanent comments. I had his courses in college as an undergraduate, but because I didn't study with him, I would see him at every convention, and he and I would have a long conversation because he felt comfortable talking to me because I was not directly in his circle. And he was very upset because when President Clinton appointed him to host a series of community conversations on race around the country, he quit doing that because the white men would show up and say, you're promoting reverse discrimination. So it was not about let's deal with the reality. It's individuals like Bakke saying that I'm being discriminated against because I did not get what I wanted. People do not look at the fact that Bakke applied to 118 different medical schools and they all said no. And yet he's going to say I didn't get in because some unqualified black or some unqualified woman or some other unqualified other took my spot. So we have to have a conversation about who owns what in America and who is entitled to what in America, and that has never happened. So hopefully part of what happens at this commission will be an openness for this college to talk about publicly and privately and institutionally in how to have the conversation and to have those conversations. And to be open to hearing somebody's perspective that is different. One of the shocks and tragedies was the petition started last year by a number of alumni students, and I was surprised at that. I was surprised at that.
So what surprised you about that? I mean, they were expressing, my understanding is they were expressing hurt for the experiences they had when they had been students.
Right.
And felt that those situations were still ongoing. But you were surprised by
Well,
that?
I had taught many of them in my classes, and certainly we had tangential conversations, but nothing as profound as they articulated in there. And
So you were surprised just because you were in the dark about what they were actually
yes,
experiencing.
yes.
Right. I think that letter or petition was eye-opening and eye-popping to many people. But if that is the experience of these people, we need to know it. And
Right.
We need to
I'm not
address it.
invalidating it.
Yeah.
I'm not
Right,
invalidating it at
right.
all. And because I had heard
Right.
bits and pieces,
Mm-hmm.
but I did not know that it was so profound. Moreover, what surprised me is how many white students then commented about their experiences with their black and other people years before and during the current time. So there is this pervasive notion that this place is not as hospitable to those who are racially different. And certainly we can talk about the other populations of difference as we like to portray.
Right.
So we need to come to terms with that.
Right. So I do think some sort of reckoning is in our future, and really for our survival, for our continued growth. And I do think that might not be easy. It won't be a straight and smooth way, but I think we're going to have to face some of these things head on. And I think commend you and the commission for looking at these things straight on.
Yeah. And we will. And
Yeah.
we will. And we will.
Yeah. Well, we've gone while, and this has been great to hear all of your experiences. So I just want to give you a chance to sum up anything you want. You have any special memories of Randolph-Macon you'd like to share, or any satisfying experience, or just anything else you would like to share about your time at Randolph-Macon.
I am grateful that I was allowed to be a faculty member at this place for the 16 years I've been here. I'm especially grateful for the chance to do study abroad. That has just been, even though it's a lot of work. Last year with my crutch or my cane in Kenya was a lot of work. Special memories are at some of my Juneteenth programs when many of my biological family members saw me in a tuxedo on the Blackwell stage.
Yeah.
And they heard me speak. I started each of those by acknowledging my Aunt Margaret, who was, the last time she attended, she was about 95, 96. My older brother, various family members. So that has been personally among the high points. The other high points have been how open this college has been to being sort of in the vanguard. I remember one of the movies we showed, and we had a community conversation, and it ended up being about 125 people from the college and 125 people from the community. And I remember two of the people who spoke were my cousins, Reverend Marvin Fields, who has a church in Caroline, and he was just effusive with showing the movie. I think it was Harriet, and we had conversations about that, and just people from those churches. So in some ways, the college has signaled that it is open for those kind of campus community experiences and dialogues. And I would certainly encourage the college to continue to do that. Moreover, I think the college is set on a path that is very good in hiring a more diverse faculty, because over the years, some of the people hired have not been typical Randolph-Macon people, and I think that's very positive. And the college has been very, very good about opening up the campus to women, for example. They're far more now than when you and I came in 2005. And putting those people in administrative jobs. And I think we need to continue that legacy of being open to whoever is out there and who seeks to be a part of the Randolph-Macon family. So I encourage the college to continue to do that.
Very good. Well, I just want to add, again, for the record, the influence you've been on me and the Macon Memories Oral History Project. When Ginger Young and I was starting this back in 2007, you were very helpful and instructive, and you've been a real supporter to me and to Lori Preston, who had several other oral history projects. And you encouraged us to go to the Oral History Association and present papers, and I just want to say I'm just very grateful for all the support you've given me through the years. So,
It's a pleasure.
thank you. And thank you for all you've done for Randolph-Macon, faculty, staff, students,
during your 16 years. We will miss you when you retire, but we're glad that you will be close by in Frog Level, and we hope you'll be back on campus for many events and that we'll see a lot more of you.
I plan to. My tentative schedule calls for coming to the library here at least once a week and just hide myself in the corner and
Wonderful.
just try to do some work, yeah.
Well, good. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you in the
Yeah,
library
yeah.
especially. Thank you so much, Professor Jefferson.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.